Hey folks, happy Sunday. I just wanted to give you some video feedback from the studio here and answer some of your questions because there were so many of them and they were very thoughtful. Thank you for participating in the class. I love teaching this class. It's such an informative class, especially if you're somebody who's new to working with sound and music or you're just taking this class as an elective. Hopefully you'll get a better and deeper insight into how the whole film scoring thing works and operates. So here we go. First question, when doing a project as the composer, do you have full control of the music used in the score after the producer and director decide the type of music they want? Is documentary scoring easier to do than regular film? Great question. They're all great questions, Trey. I ask because I have been taking interest in film scoring just off of this class alone. I think I would be a far better film score composer than making beats for hip hop and R&B. I respect the art form. So, first part of the question, when doing a project as a composer, do you have full control? No, you do not. Most of the decisions that are made in regards to the film music, I just have to move this over, sorry. Most of the decisions that have to be made regarding the composition and what you're going to be right are being made by the director and the film editor, the producers. So essentially, what you're doing is you're being brought onto the project as though you are an actor or another character in the story. And you have to create a performance that's a little bit more abstract in that there's not this narrative script that's written down for you to follow. You have to actually create something that they want that they can't articulate to you, if that makes any sense. So what this means in its simplest form is that most of the time you're given a temp track as a guide track and you write music that's like that temp track. As you become more established in film scoring, they use your music as temp track. This is what happens in my situation for the most part on the last couple of films that I've done, where they are actually just making sure I have audio here. They are actually putting in temp music, music that I've done from other films or music that I've already sent them, and they're saying, hey, we really like this. Can you write something like this? If you own this music, can we use this music? We like what you've done in this particular piece of composition. It works well to picture, but we want you to do something that's more appropriate to what we've shot or what our story's trying to tell. On the in rare cases, they give me the option of going carte blanche and writing whatever I want. That's a little bit dangerous though, because as a film composer, you're really wanting directions from people because it gets way too complicated when you're out there on your own and you're given no real guidance or sort of focus in terms of what you're trying to do. Is documentary scoring easier? No, it's actually not, because you're writing, if big films are orchestra, music, big arrangements, documentary films which have voiceover from usually beginning to end. There's some kind of huge dialogue component because it's people telling a story, a non-fictional real narrative story. You have to work around all of that dialogue. And so it really involves writing a more intimate score, smaller arrangements, but more intricate arrangements to kind of cover all of that narrative dialogue that they're giving you with music so that the story that they're telling is more compelling, since you often don't have the kind of CGI imagery. Of course, if you're working on a documentary, and I've done several of these, Saving Face is the standout where the imagery is just so powerful, then the score becomes a little bit more cinematic and the arrangements are larger. And in some ways, it's easier to write that because you have imagery that's carrying the idea and the narrative across versus the just the story that the characters are telling. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of clarity on that. Let's see, we've got some other questions. I wonder if you start using, so this is Yunju, I wonder if you start by using a MIDI sequence program or transcribing at music note. So I always start by turning on this software you're seeing over here, Logic, and I just start playing immediately. I will post a video of a sketch I'm working on for an upcoming film. They haven't finished with the rough cut of the film yet. They've given me an assembly cut, so I'm working off of that. And unfortunately, I can't show you any footage, but I can show you the session I'm working on. And that session is just driven purely by me opening up Logic or the DAW, which is what I'm using to make my scores on, putting in a whole bunch of instruments and just playing right away based on what I've seen in the assembly cut. So I always start with MIDI, using a keyboard or some other MIDI instrument to sort of put that info in. And then over the course of the project, I'll readapt a lot of that so that it works better with scenes, or I'll cut some of it out, or I'll change it into separate pieces of music that cover each scene. It's always a process that evolves, but yes, I start by playing music. I'm not a composer who sits down with pen and paper, and I don't write manuscript, even though I'm a classically trained musician and I can read. There are very few composers now who work like that. A few still do, and I know some video game composers that work like that. I know John Williams works like that. I know there are a few composers that do, but most of us sit down, much like Hans Zimmer, and we sit in front of a rig like this, and we just compose using MIDI and sample-based instruments. Great question. Great questions. Music developments like voicing. So I'm going to answer part two. Is it important to do working on harmonic voicing and chord voicing? I'm working that way, but I'm also working on a sound of the film and ambience for the film. So I sort of have a Bernard Herrmann-esque way of looking at film, where I'm trying to figure out what the ambience should feel in the film. And that's not purely musical. It has more to do with space, and it has more to do with the sonic timbre of things. How are things sounding versus specific chords that I'm writing? So, Angela, so hopefully that answers your question. Angela would like to know, I would love to know more, which music software to use in which process. Okay. So for scoring, I use Logic, but for the assembly of the entire score, I use Pro Tools. Now, I don't make music in Pro Tools, but I use Pro Tools as a delivery platform, as do most composers when we're delivering to a sound mix stage and we have to put all of the assets together. The reason for that is Pro Tools is what all the other sound assets are being delivered to the film and ultimately being mixed on. So the platform of combining everything is Pro Tools, but the creation platform is different. And so the creation platform I'm using is Logic, and that's what I'm using. All right. Okay, DJ Dara, what do you think are the most important basic fundamentals someone should learn in production, as in techniques and software? So this is important. What should you learn first? Complicated. What should you learn first? What I always tell people is, if you're writing music for film or TV or media, and I'll just call it media since that's what all of this is, you're working on creating the sound of the film, the sound of the score, and the music. So you're talking about musical know-how and production know-how. They're both equally as important. So understanding mixing is just as important as understanding composing. Understanding composing is just as important as understanding synthesis. So that's all mixed together. And as somebody who began their life as a classically trained musician, who studied music production and engineering, who teaches everything from film scoring to how to make beats, my background is both as a performer and as a producer, not really as a composer. So composition came last for me. So the fundamentals of understanding production techniques as they relate to recording music and producing music are super important. And the software, Digital Performer, Logic Pro, Pro Tools, Cubase, all that stuff, that's you have to know at least one of those DAWs, as they're called in the modern day nomenclature of film, really, really well, or music production. So I would recommend really getting to know Logic or Cubase or Digital Performers, since those are the three sort of heavyweights as they relate to producing music for anything, whether it's film or music production. What are your thoughts 10 years ago, film scoring, to today, basically when you started to now? Well, fundamentally, in terms of a technical thing, things haven't changed that much between 10 years ago and now. There's a lot of new software platforms, but the way that I'm producing scores now is exactly the same way I was producing them 10 years ago. Um, I've gotten a lot better as a composer, so I'm working a lot faster. That's the one thing that's changed. The other thing that's changed, which is a little less musically centric, but more focused on the picture side of this, is because of offline editing processes, as exemplified by the use of Adobe Premiere and Final Cut Pro, films no longer have the traditional arc of shoot, assembly, rough, fine cut, and done. They have a completely crazy process of being put together, which means the process has become so nonlinear that it's not uncommon for me to not get a final cut of the film until I'm actually on my way to LA and there's a mix stage that's been booked. And then I sit down with the score and we implement the score, and scenes have actually changed. And then it's up to the music editor and me to figure out how to make those things work. So the biggest change that I've witnessed, or I've been witness to, has been how we've taken the structure of creating film from film, taken it to video, and then made it possible to edit a movie on an iPad or a laptop on an airplane, and then having the composer having to conform to those constant changes. Film music has also changed a lot. For me, film music is a lot less about writing the big, giant, epic melody, and it's more about, if I'm looking over here, I'm just making sure I'm actually recording decent audio for you folks, since the camera audio is not so good. So there's a lot of changes as they relate to the style of music in terms of everybody wanting hybrid electronic ambient score. That's the real big difference. Is a movement away from these deeply held melodic concepts of what a film score should be. And if you listen to like or you listen to the Joker, for example, Hildur Gottesdottir with the whole that score, that's where the evolution is. And there's a lot of great film composers from the world and from the circle of Johan Johansson who are sort of, and she started there, and that have been developing these more sort of ambient scores. And I've been involved in doing a lot of that as well in my own work. So that's something I'm very keen on in terms of working on, in terms of creating a more ambient style of scoring. I don't know, that's a long, kind of very verbose answer to your question, Yasmin, so I'm hoping it works. This is another great question by Alexandra. As a composer, but even more as a creator, do you feel that the industry of composing music for films has evolved beneficially or harmfully? How many of people's feedback critiques do you actually take into consideration when it comes to you composing a film score? I think I don't know if it's evolved harmfully or it's beneficial, but there's a lot of cooks in the kitchen, and there's a lot of people telling you what you should and shouldn't do. And I find that with the advent of, it's interesting. So the craft of making a film is it's a group of people being extremely focused on getting something done. In other words, they take their iPads and their cell phones and they throw them in the garbage can while they're working. Often I'll be at a film mix and there'll be some producer looking at their phone while we're trying to finish a $5 million or $10 million film. And they look up occasionally and they mention things. And they're not actually paying attention to what's actually going on. And so their suggestions are purely being made to ensure that they have a job, so that they appear as though they're working, when in fact they're not really doing anything. So I think the sort of general societal scatterbrainedness, as I like to call it, has made it a little bit more complicated in terms of getting people to focus on the craft of what this is, if that makes any sense. And I think that the emphasis on ambient scoring, although amazing, there's a lot of skill to writing ambient music, and I've written quite a bit of it. it's not simple. It's not just sitting on a keyboard and playing a note. It's blending and mixing things. And I find that the whole idea of soundscaping, as I like to call it, has gotten a little bit too carried away. I think there needs to be more of a focus on traditional musical writing, whether that's knowing how to write an R&B tune or a hip hop tune or a concerto or something in the style of Baroque. All that stuff you need to know how to do as a composer. And so I think there's less of an emphasis on the compositional side and more of an emphasis on, hey, you've got a great, let's make this cool soundscape thing. And that's all well and good, and I love doing that stuff. But it's also important to know the fundamentals of music, where music comes from, having a history and a historical context for jazz, what periods there are in classical music, the fact that the music that we're listening to now came from somewhere, where did it come from? Having sort of context for things is something I'm noticing that a lot of folks are losing, a sense of history around art and where art comes from. And that's just as important for music as it is for painting, because there's so much of that's, that lack of knowledge or that lack of interest in having that knowledge is really kind of having a really negative impact on all art forms, not just being a composer. So that's a very long answer to that question. Sorry about the long pause. Does a soundtrack, so Anna, this is your question. Does a soundtrack get made while the film is being written, or is a soundtrack made after it's been written? This is something I've been thinking about for a majority of these modules. I have been hired early in production. I've read a script, and they've actually asked me to write music based on the script or based on the idea or the outline of the project. So during the course of filming, yes, that can actually happen if a composer is assigned. Dailies, which are the sort of the daily progress of the movie, those are produced. And often if the director is really, really keen on having the particular score, I did one 2 years ago where the director went to Africa to film this huge feature-length doc, and while she was in Africa, she was like, do you have music for me? We're sending you footage. We just sent the footage back to Los Angeles. You'll get it in a few days. Watch what we shot over these 3 days. Whatever inspires you, send me some music, because I like hearing your music while we're actually shooting. So yes, that does happen. It's it's a wonderful, very elastic way to work. The only downside as a composer is it often gets you involved in a project for a really, really long time, for sometimes several years before you actually get to a point where you start conforming things to picture. So that lead time, although really productive and cool and awesome and great, can often lead to an extended relationship going far beyond what has been budgeted for. So you have to be careful about that. Okay, folks, I'm running out of time on my memory card. So I'm going to post this today, Sunday, and best of luck with the rest of the modules. I will be very, one thing, if you're really writing in the discussion topics, great. If you're sort of doing a cursory, 1 or 2 sentences, no, really think about what's being talked about in the class and write those, because that, of course, is a part of your grade. So on that note, everybody's been doing a great job, though. The papers have been great, and if you have any other questions regarding things that I should cover or thoughts or ideas, please let me know. Have a great day, and remember to wear your masks.